Pentateuch class for July 31, 2021. We will continue to study the book of Exodus. Moses and the people of Israel had gone out of Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. God had promised them a new place to live. Along the way, God also showed them what it means to be His people. Remember the key passage, one of the most important passages in the entire Old Testament, is found in Exodus chapter 19. These are words that God gave to Moses after the people had crossed through the Red Sea. God said, beginning in verse 3, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So the people needed to keep God's covenant with their part of the covenant God made with them. And so the key idea for us to think about is, what is a covenant? Let's think about theology of covenant. The term covenant. The English word covenant comes from a French word. The Hebrew word is called berit and occurs 286 times in the Old Testament. Etymology. Etymology is a word that is used for the history or the background of a word. This word is a feminine noun which means to eat or to dine. It's based on a covenant meal which was eaten at the time of a treaty. It is something that binds two people or groups together in a relationship. A covenant entails obligation and commitment. A covenant shows that one or both parties has agreed to do certain things. In the Old Testament, the word cutting is used to make a covenant 84 times. An animal is typically split into two, as we saw in the story of Abraham when God made a covenant with him in Genesis 15. The animal is cut in half, and therefore a covenant is made. A covenant is cut. Loyalty to covenant is shown by the important Old Testament word called hesed, which means covenantal faithfulness. It is often translated as steadfast love, kindness, and loyalty. That would be a good word to look up sometime and do a word study. It's one of the top 5 words in the Old Testament. God's loving kindness is shown through covenant. Covenant in the ancient Near East. Studying how the ancient Near East people created covenants is helpful for us as we study the Old Testament. The idea of covenant was widely used in the ancient Near East. Covenants kept societies in order, and it helped to build community. The Old Testament borrows the idea of covenant between God and humanity from the human to human covenants of the ancient Near East. There are different levels to covenant. Personal relationships, these notes got messed up. Personal relationships and political or international relationships. An oath was taken at the time when the two parties agree to a relationship. The oath was usually taken by the weaker party. This was followed by a ceremony of some kind of sacrifice, usually of an animal. And the animal was split in two, and there was a swearing that went something like this: "May the same thing happen to me as to this animal if I break this covenant." In other words, if I break the terms of this treaty, this covenant relationship, may I be split in two, just like this animal. And then the animal was sacrificed, and then there was a covenant meal, or some kind of ceremony, such as the exchange of clothing, like we see with the story of David and Jonathan. There were two types of treaties. The first type is called a suzerainty treaty, and it was between a king and his vassals. Vassals is an Old Testament scholar word that means the lesser party. And so this type of treaty is an unequal between the great king and those that he has conquered, also known as the vassals. And the other type of treaty is called a parity treaty, and this was between two kings. It was between two equal parties. The type of treaty or covenant we see in the Old Testament between God and humanity is clearly a suzerainty treaty. God is the sovereign power, and the people of Israel were his vassals. They were dependent upon God. This was not an equal one-to-one kind of situation. We do see some parity treaties in the Old Testament between kings. The structures of the treaties. This comes from discoveries from the Hittite people. The form used here is not rigid. It can be mixed up, or some parts can be missing. But we see this general idea in most covenant treaties. First of all, there's a preamble or an introduction. And here, the powers or the attributes of the great king are listed. Then this is followed by a historical prologue, what the great king has done for his vassals. And then comes the stipulations. These are the obligations of the weaker party. This is what the conquered people must do in obedience to the great king. And then the terms of the treaty are deposited in a temple, and they are to be read periodically. The gods are called as witnesses, or sometimes elements of nature. And then there are curses and blessings. Curses if you disobey or break the covenant, and blessings if you keep the terms of the covenant. Now we can see these different forms quite often, almost exactly like this in the Old Testament. The Old Testament followed the common pattern for covenant making of the ancient world. There are two types of covenants in the Old Testament. A promissory covenant. There's no formal obligation. It's just simply a promise. We see that type of covenant with Noah, Abraham, and David. And then there's obligatory covenants, where there's the emphasis is upon the stipulations and the blessings. And the blessings are dependent upon obedience. And we can see that type of covenant made on Sinai, which we'll look at in a minute, and Adam and Eve have a very simple form of an obligatory covenant. The biblical concept of covenant. If you want to study one thing, this would be very helpful, because so much of the Old Testament is built upon the covenant concept. To me, in my own studies, I was confused by a lot of the Bible until I took a class devoted to the covenant concept of the Old Testament. And then I understood the Old Testament so much better. God used common elements to show the profound relationship between him and the people of Israel. God demands exclusive loyalty. The people of Israel were to worship God only. God is the great king, and Israel is his vassal. Therefore, Israel must follow the stipulations that God lays out. They are obligated. God is also the husband of Israel, and Israel is his wife. And this talks about mutual love. We see this kind of covenant, which is really a marriage covenant, talked about by the prophet Hosea. The morality of Israel that we see in the law is directly connected with covenant. Righteousness is the outflow of relationship within covenant. Also, covenant shows God's love and grace towards the people. Covenant creates peace. If the people keep the terms of the covenant, then they will experience peace in the land. The two words, covenant and peace, often go together in the Old Testament. The opposite of peace, or the Hebrew word is shalom. The Hebrew word is shalom. The opposite of shalom is evil. The idea of community could be described as one in covenant. And so if people keep the terms of the covenant, there will be peace and justice, where everyone works together for the good of the community. The weak are cared for in this kind of situation. The poor are cared for by the rich. Everyone is at peace and everyone prospers, and they have what they need. Covenant then creates peace. Oh, this should be like this. The idea of Israel's election is directly tied up with covenant. The people of Israel did not deserve God's choice of them. There was nothing in themselves, but God chose them out of grace. Covenant made Israel to be God's people and confirmed their election. God chose them to be in a covenant relationship with them. We can see how God protected them as they fled Egypt. God kept them safe. God provided manna and quail and water out in the wilderness so that the people could survive. God protected them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The people needed to prepare. Israel had a special relationship with God in the passage that we just read from Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 to 8. They were God's special possession, his special people. God had chosen them so that God could show his grace to the world. They were to be a kingdom of priests, not full of priests, but they were to be priests to the rest of the world. They were to be the go-between between God and sinful humanity. And so God had chosen them to go to the rest of the world. By the way, Israel did not do very good at being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They were to be set apart. They were to model God's holy character. The human response to all of this is that the people were consecrated. In Exodus chapter 19, verses 9 through 15. So the people agree that we will do everything that the Lord has told us to do. And so Moses consecrated the people that day. They washed their clothes and they were at the foot of Mount Sinai. They could not go up to the mountain because the mountain was holy. God was in the process of making them holy. And so they were consecrated and set apart. They washed their clothes, no sexual relations, and they were to stay right where they were, restricted movements. God's response was a revelation of his glory upon the mountain. The mountain was now a holy place, and only Moses and Aaron could go on top of the mountain. Exodus chapter 20 is the giving of the Ten Commandments. This is also known as the Decalogue. Deca means 10, and log means word. The 10 words. This is given in the form of a suzerainty treaty. It begins with the typical form of a suzerainty treaty and starts with the preamble in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. The preamble is very simple. I am the Lord your God. Nothing more needs to be said about God as the great king. This is followed by the historical prologue. The historical prologue is rather brief in this case. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery? God's identity is linked to his salvation. This is followed by the stipulations. The stipulations are what we would call the Ten Commandments. And there's more than just 10, but 10 primary commandments. These are divided into two parts using the second person masculine singular. First of all, there is relationship with God in verses, actually this should be verses 4 through 11. This is mixed up. 4 through 11. Relationship with God. This corresponds to, Jesus said, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so very simply, the first commandment, no other gods. This is the most basic and fundamental statement of theology. This is the who of our worship. All other commands are built on this one command. This is the basic temptation of human life, to replace God with something or someone else. For example, in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, the problem with people is that they replace the worship of God with the worship of something else. The most basic command, no other gods. The second command, no graven images. This is the how of worship. Worship of God was not to be transferred to the senses, lest the people turn to idolatry. St. Augustine defined idolatry as worshiping anything that ought to be used or using anything that is meant to be worshipped. The reason for this is that God is jealous and does not tolerate divided allegiance. Our choice has lasting consequences on our families. So this particular command has quite a bit to it. What we worship will impact our lives, our families, our culture, and everything else. We must not substitute anything that has been created for God. The third command is profanity, making something vain, useless, or empty. This is giving religious lip service to God. This is talking about God in ways that are improper, inferior, or that do not match God's character. It's more than just simply saying God's name in a flippant way. That's part of it, but we can take the name of the Lord in vain in many ways by not honoring who God is. The fourth command is to keep the Sabbath. This is God's pattern for rest and reflection when we are to think about who God is as the God of creation. The Bible lists 7 different groups that are to rest on the Sabbath day. And then the next set of commands deal with our relationships with other people. This corresponds to the second greatest command that Jesus gave, to love our neighbor as ourselves. First of all, the first one of this set is to honor our parents. This protects the family and it gives order to society. If we do not honor our parents, society will begin to break down and there will be problems. To honor means to respect, obey, and it shows some kind of honor. It is used for how we are to honor God in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. There is a promise given, and Paul the Apostle highlights this in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. And the promise is that if you honor your parents, then things will go well in the land. That is because there will be a structure and order to society. If children do not honor their parents, then the society will begin to break down and things will not go well in the land anymore. We wonder why so many cultures are having problems. That's because children are not honoring their parents. The next one is no murder. Life was sacred for Israel and was not to be taken lightly. This is directly related to the people's view of life. Jesus expanded this idea of murder to just simply being angry with our brother or sister in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22. The next one is no adultery. This protects marriage and thus the means for procreation. Marriage is part of God's plan for creation. Jesus expanded on this also in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. The next one is no stealing. This protects the property rights and the value of work. People work for their food and their clothing and their shelter. Why do you take it away from those who work? And so this is a way to honor what people do to earn and to work for their food. The next one is no lying. Do not tell a lie. This protects the truth and integrity. It also reins in the loose tongue. We could read James chapter 3 for more reflection about that. And the last commandment is no coveting. This one really gets to the deep human problem. We should guard the heart from sin. And we need to value other people. Coveting sees other people and what they possess as objects for us to use and abuse. Coveting is all about the self, which lies at the heart of sin. To not covet would show the respect of the rights of other people. Well, there's more commands that are more cultic in nature and not so much about the moral code, but they're all the following several chapters give or they expand upon these 10 commandments. All commandments in the Bible can somehow be boiled down to two commands: love God and love our neighbor. And these 10 commandments expand those two primary commandments and make it and help us to understand some ways to apply them. Well, after God gave Moses the stipulations, these are then deposited in Exodus 25, verse 16. And you shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you. And so the terms of the treaty, what we call the 10 Commandments, are supposed to be deposited in they were written on stone tablets, and they were to be put inside the Ark of the Covenant. And then the curses and blessings, those are scattered throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, but they are especially given in Deuteronomy chapter 28. They are expanded. And basically, if the people kept the terms of the covenant, then they would be blessed, and the land would produce a rich harvest, and there would be peace and prosperity. But if the people disobeyed the terms of the covenant, then they would become slaves in their own land, and they would have to toil and work hard for their food. The land would reject them. And we can see how that actually happens throughout the history of Israel, particularly in the book of Judges. And then finally, this covenant is ratified or confirmed through a sacrifice, meal, and sprinkling of blood in Exodus chapter 24. So the 10 Commandments and the making of the covenant very much follows the pattern of the ancient world. The purpose of the law. Let's think about the law. Sometimes people think of the law as a set of do's and don'ts. You do the good things so you're not punished, and you avoid the bad things. Well, the purpose of the law is much deeper than that, much more significant. The law reveals God's glory and holiness. It reveals what God wants the people to become. God called them to be holy. How would they know what it means to be holy? They had to look to God's law. God's law defined holiness and showed how the people could become God's holy people. The law reveals God's glory and holiness. The law also reveals sin. We would not know what sin is without the law. Paul the Apostle makes that clear in Romans chapter 7, verses 7 and 13. The law tells us what sin is. We would not know that stealing is wrong unless God told us that it's wrong. We would not know that any other sins are sins unless the law told us about that. The law is very important. The law also shows God's election of Israel. They were special, and they had received God's law. It was a priceless treasure to them. The law revealed to Israel God's standard for living in the promised land. This is what God expected from them as they went into the promised land. They were to be different than the Canaanites and the other people who lived in that Holy Land area. They needed to live in a different way. They were set aside to be special as God's people, and they would show that by how they lived. The law also shows our need for Christ. We would not know that we are sinners in need of salvation unless the law told us. The law shows us to be sinners, and it is our temporary guide until we come to Jesus Christ. We can read about that in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. The law foreshadows what is to come through Jesus. The Old Testament law and the covenant prepared the way for Jesus. We can read about that in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. Well, how did the people respond to the giving of the law? Well, the people were filled with fear. Moses was to act as a mediator. What is the purpose of the fear of the Lord? Look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 20. There we read, Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." The fear of God should keep us from sinning, because we do not want to face God's wrath and judgment. The regulations are given on idols and altars, next in chapter 20, verses 22 to 26. The altar was a special place to meet God. It was where God and humanity were to meet, was at the altar. Further regulations, called the Covenant Code, are given in chapters 21 to 23. This follows the form of what is called the casuistic laws. A casuistic law is one that has a condition to it. If such and such happens, then this is the type of response that you should give. So some kind of situation or condition is given, and then the response of the people. That's the kind of laws that we get in chapters 21 to 23. It begins with indentured Hebrew servants. A Hebrew could only be enslaved for 6 years to pay off a debt. A slave could be pierced by the ear and become a servant for life. This is sometimes called a love slave. And a slave would do this possibly because he's married into the master's family and wants to become part of the family. There are penalties for personal injuries in chapter 21, verses 12 to 36. The basic principle of this part is that the punishment must fit the crime and not personal vengeance. If someone, for example, injured you, you cannot go and kill that person. You can only do an equal injury back. This might seem kind of cruel in our day and age, but it's actually just. If you steal from me, then you have to pay exactly what you stole from me. And sometimes there's additional payment that has to be made. The next are laws concerning property. The basic principle here is fair compensation. And then this is followed by laws concerning social responsibility and abuse. And then the laws of justice and mercy. Everyone was to be treated with fairness and compassion. And then finally, laws governing worship, laws related to the Sabbath and the 3 annual feasts of unleavened bread, harvest, which later became known as Pentecost, and Feast of the Tabernacles. And so these laws are very practical for the people. It would help them begin to live out what God wanted for them. Right away, they were to begin to act in certain ways that would set them apart and help them to come to know God's expectations of them as His holy people. And then in chapter 23, verses 20 to 33, we get promises of the law. God would send an angel to guide the people to the promised land. And this angel would have God's name. Angels in the Old Testament represent God's presence among His people. And then God would give them prosperity in the land if they obeyed everything he commanded. This is another form of promise with an obligation. There's a condition for happiness, prosperity, and peace in the land. And that condition is that the people must be obedient. And number 3, God will help them conquer the land by sending ahead of them the fear of him. The people in the land of promise would fear Israel. God would be working ahead of Israel before they even got to the land. This is a form of, or a type of prevenient grace. God was already at work preparing the way for the people as they entered the promised land. The Israelites were not to make any covenant with the conquered people, lest these people lead them astray. They could not compromise. They needed to remain pure and holy. And then chapter 24 is the confirmation of the covenant. Next, the next part of the book of Exodus describes God's Shekinah, or his glorious presence, and the tabernacle. The setting: Moses is up on the mountain receiving the plans for the tabernacle. The people remain down in the valley. Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days. That's a long time to be up on the mountain. The idea of 40 days becomes symbolic and important. For example, we see that Jesus fasted for 40 days also. The plan for the tabernacle is described in chapters 25 through 31. The materials for the tabernacle were to be supplied by free will offerings of the people. The tabernacle was made of 14 different materials. It was supposed to be portable. It was a portable shrine. These kind of portable shrines were typical of the ancient Near East. And then the plan is also described. We'll look at the plan here in a few minutes. And then we get the ministers of the tabernacle, what they were supposed to look like and what kind of things they were supposed to do. The garments: Aaron and his 4 sons were designated as priests. Aaron was to wear special garments as the high priest. The priests then are consecrated. I think that's the wrong. Wrong chapter number. That should be 29. The priests are consecrated. This is a form of ordination. Some of you are preparing for ordination. This is the ordination of Aaron and his sons. And then we get the priestly duties. They are to offer burnt offerings. Everything must be consecrated, and this was critical for God's presence to be with the people. They would burn incense. They would administer the atonement money, the money that was collected. And then they needed to wash their hands and feet regularly. They were to be pure and holy. They used sacred substances, anointing of oil, and the incense for the altar. In chapter 31, we get the construction plans. The appointment of special craftsmen: Bezalel of Judah and Aholiab of Dan. This is the first time in the Bible that we get a reference to being filled with the Spirit of God. The workers were filled. Bezalel was filled with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit empowered them to do special things. They were given special abilities in order to build the tabernacle. God gives Moses the 2 tablets with the 10 commandments written with God's finger. The purpose of the tabernacle was to be a place of God's presence among his people. The ark became very important throughout Israel's history and a symbol of God's presence among his people. But the people, towards the end, began to take God's presence for granted. And then the ark disappears from history with the Babylonian destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 587. No one knows what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. One theory is that the Babylonians took it to Babylon. Maybe they melted it down. There's one theory that it was taken to Egypt through those people who fled, like Jeremiah. We really have no idea what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. This is a picture of what the tabernacle may have looked like. You can see pictures like this on the internet or in different kinds of books. This is just one that I found. It shows how the tabernacle was laid out. Fairly big in size, and so there would be some kind of a tent structure around, so that what was inside is kind of a special area. And then there would be the big altar outside where the sacrifices were offered. The people would bring in the animals, and they would be sacrificed or slaughtered out in this area, and then burnt on the big altar. There was a place here called the brazen laver, where a washing could be done. And then the tabernacle itself. And so it's covered, and it's basically a movable tent. Everything here is movable. And this is called the holy place. And I have a picture of the tabernacle itself. And so this is called the holy place, with a table of showbread, a golden lampstand, and the altar of incense. And then the inner area called the most holy place. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The high priest could only go in here one time a year on the Day of Atonement. And this is a basic idea of what the Ark of the Covenant may have looked like. 2 cherubim with their wings outspread, and at the center of this is the place where God's presence was said to dwell. This is called the throne of grace. This is basically a large chest with certain objects inside, such as the stone tablets of 10 Commandments, a sample of the manna, and later Moses' staff, and some other objects were put into the Ark of the Covenant. Well, things were actually not going so well when Moses was up on the mountain, and that is given in chapters 32 to 34. The tabernacle building is interrupted by the making of a golden calf. The problem. On the surface, the problem was Moses' delay in coming down from the mountain. He was up there for 40 days, and the people were getting impatient. They're wondering what happened to him. Maybe he died or something. Let's get going then. But the deeper problem was really the people doubted God. They did not believe in God's promises. They did not believe in what God had said, and they even doubted God. And their solution was to form a god out of gold, a golden calf, to lead them back to Egypt. The calf was worshipped down in Egypt. The people were returning back to spiritual slavery. They wanted to go back to Egypt, where they could look at their gods. Aaron's leadership in all of this, we kind of have to wonder, what was his intention? Later on, his excuse was he just kind of threw the gold into the fire and out came this calf. So he was culpable, he was guilty as well. The spiritual issues. The people were impatient. They did not wait for God and God's laws and what Moses was going to tell them. This was a violation of God's will. This story illustrates the depth of human depravity. And God's response to all this, God said he's going to wipe them out, start all over, create a new people through Moses. Be done with all these sinful people. God could still fulfill his promise, and he could do that through Moses. This was really a test of Moses' ambitions. Did Moses want now everything to go through him? And Moses said no. He interceded for the people. His anger burned, and he broke the tablets, he burned the calf, scattered the remains in water, and the people had to drink the water. He rebuked Aaron for this great sin. He commanded those who continued in the revelry, they just continued on in their partying, to be killed. And then he promised to make atonement through prayer. A powerful passage to study is Moses' intercession in chapters 30, the end of chapter 32 and into chapter 33. He acknowledges the sins of the people, and he asks for forgiveness, or that his name be blotted out. God strikes the people with a plague. God threatens to leave the people. There's no need to construct the tabernacle. God was done with all of that. In his absolute holiness, God could not tolerate an unholy people. They needed to depart or be destroyed. God was holy, and anyone who is to be in relationship with God must also be holy. The people respond by taking off their ornaments made for the golden calf. Moses sets up a tent of meeting with God, and he communes with God face to face. The next passage is also significant. God's self-disclosure. Moses pleads to see God's presence, to be in God's presence. God's promise was that he would go with the people. And let's look at chapter 33, verses 12 and 13. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, 'Bring up this people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you said, 'I know you by name,' and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight." Moses wants to see God's glory. Moses and God says, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." God would forgive the people. And he said, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." Moses said, God, unless you go with us, do not send us. We need you. We must have you with us. And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight. Now Moses asks a very significant thing in verse 18. He says, please show me your glory. And the next passage is called a theophany, an appearance of God. The awesomeness of God's presence is too overwhelming, and Moses is only able to see God's back, which is kind of an anthropomorphism, a metaphoric saying, because God appears in some kind of visible way for Moses. And God's presence is so overwhelming that Moses has to hide behind a rock and then can only see the fading glory of God. God's glory is too awesome for any human being to be in God's presence. God gives new stone tablets. And then a very significant statement is given in chapter 34, verses 6 to 7. 7 divine attributes. And so as God passed before Moses, God proclaimed, the Lord, and that's the divine name Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin, but who will not by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. That's a great passage to preach from at some point. Very powerful. We see God's loving side, God's holy side, but also God's just side. And the people renew covenant in chapter 34. There's a restatement of the major stipulations. Can be no compromise with paganism. They cannot make any graven images at all. They must appear before God 3 times at the major festivals. What was the purpose of these festivals? It was to remind the people of what God had done for them. That's the purpose of holidays. Holidays are given in Scripture to help the people of God remember the story of God's salvation. And Moses then returns to the camp with a glowing face, so bright that he had to wear a veil to cover the glow of being in God's presence. I call him the glow-in-the-dark Moses. And then the construction of the tabernacle is carried out in chapters 35 through 40. The preparations are made in chapters 35 and 36. The materials are gathered. The supervisors are appointed. There's a free will offering. Everything is to come from the people and what they had. Remember, the Egyptians sent the people of Israel with a lot of goods and gifts. And those goods and gifts were to be used for the building of the tabernacle. And then the labor was all volunteer. Chapter 36 gives the construction of the tabernacle. There's some question as to the exact size, for example, what the length of a cubit is, but most scholars have come to an agreement about what a cubit is. And then the furnishings are made. For the tabernacle, the ark is constructed, the mercy seat, the table, lampstand, and altar of incense. All of these are described. And then the courtyard, the altar of burnt offerings, and the bronze laver, or the place to wash. And then the accounting of all the materials is given in chapter 38. The priestly garments are described in chapter 39. And then the tabernacle is dedicated. Lots of details in these chapters. It's kind of interesting if you read through these. But keep in mind as you read through these chapters, what is the purpose of all of this? The purpose is to draw the people closer to God, to reveal something about God's holiness and God's love and forgiveness of the people. The theology and meaning. The tabernacle was the center of Israel's worship. It was to be located at the center of the camp. The 12 tribes were to camp around the tabernacle and the courtyard. The tabernacle, number 2, was a matter of divine revelation. It was where God revealed God's presence and God's plan for the people. It was the place of sacrifices where God forgave the people. Number 3, we see the degrees of holiness. The closer one got to the Holy of Holies, the holier one must be. If anything was impure or unholy, it had to be outside the camp. As you got closer to the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies, the holier you must be. Number 4, the tabernacle perpetuated, or it kept going, the Sinai experience. The people could continue to experience God's presence through the tabernacle. Number 5, the tabernacle was holy because of the presence of God. Otherwise, it was just simply material, wood, metals, cloth. But what made it holy was the presence of God. And number 6, the tabernacle prepared for the incarnation of Jesus. Because John chapter 1 verse 14, Jesus became the tabernacle. He tabernacled, he lived among us, just like God lived among the people with the tabernacle. A summary of the key theological themes in Exodus. First of all, covenant. Very important for you to understand the covenant concept. The covenant as salvation. This is the central motif or theme of the Bible. The Old Testament is the Old Covenant. The New Testament is the New Covenant. It is hard for us to understand what Jesus did for us without understanding the Old Testament covenant concept. It's very important for you to take some time and to understand covenant and what it means. Number 2, a result of God's choice. God was gracious to the people. He forgave the people, and he chose them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They were to keep the terms of this special relationship of covenant. Number 3, this covenant was based on love, trust, service, and fellowship. The people must follow God's laws and to stay in this relationship. A second important theme in the book of Exodus is the law. The law is integrally closely related to the covenant. The two go together. The law, to break the commandments, was to break the covenant. If people did not obey God, they would break the relationship with God. Number 3, the giving of the law was a manifestation of God's love. And we could also put here of God's grace. The law was a gift to the people, and it was a sign of God's love for them. And number 4, obedience to the law was the response of love and faith, not the way to earn God's favor. The Old Testament and the New Testament do not teach something different. The people were always saved by grace, even in the Old Testament, and they obeyed out of faith and belief in God. They obeyed because they loved God, and that's a very important theme that is found throughout the entire Bible. Well, that ends our study of the book of Exodus. We will continue our study in the book of Leviticus next.